Our guests today are a trio of Shearman and Sterling partners up in New York City, Richard Alsop, Gillian, Emmett, Moldowan, and Kristina Trauger, who are part of the team that authored the 18th Annual Corporate Governance and Executive Compensation Survey. That survey covers the top 100 public companies by market cap and revenue. It's quite an undertaking. Thank you for doing it. I'm Brock Romanek, today on Zippy Point. Executive pay disclosure, it has to be my favorite topic after running a conference about executive pay for 17 years. But it's amazing as part of my proxy season spectacular how few panels I actually have about executive pay because so many other topics have gained importance. But executive pay still is the bulk of the proxy. It's still important. So Gillian, what sort of trends have you seen recently?
Absolutely, and thank you, Brock, for having me and the rest of the Shearman and Sterling team. What's interesting is that executive pay has really bled through so many other issues now and so isn't isolated to just pay metrics. The two biggest stories I would say this year are actually the interplay between executive pay and ESG, specifically the incorporation of ESG metrics into executive pay programs, and the interplay of human capital management and aspects of executive pay, and also how employees generally are being incentivized and thought of in the broader disclosure and management of a company. So it's interesting to see how it's both perhaps reduced focus because of all the other focuses, but taking on the flavor of the topics that are so hotly discussed right now. On the ESG side, I think there we're really seeing that movement into the use of ESG metrics. And what bore out in the survey itself, when we looked at this intently, is that 36 of the top 100 companies that we're looking at now are using specific ESG metrics in their executive compensation programs. And people have been talking about this trend for a while, but it's now interesting to really see how many of the companies are expressly getting to ESG measures when thinking about executive compensation. I think maybe surprisingly, but maybe not, the top two categories on ESG that are looked at for these purposes are talent and succession, so really kind of an employee management metric, and diversity, also a key metric and a key area of focus right now in so many respects. Environmental sustainability had 6 companies in our survey that were focused there. And I think what might be an area of rising interest in this year, because again, we're looking at a survey data that is a COVID-19 pandemic set of disclosures, but 5 companies included metrics related to employee health and safety. And I think that's something we could watch for in the coming year to see if there's an increase there. There's other companies as well that are including ESG as kind of a holistic, qualitative approach to looking at their executive compensation strategy. So even for companies that haven't come to put a specific metric in their plan at this point, we are seeing some companies use it in a more holistic evaluation of what's going on at the executive pay assessment level. I think certainly for companies that are thinking about incorporating ESG metrics and maybe haven't gotten there yet, you want to consider your shareholder engagement. What are people asking for in the context of your company? And that leads into identifying appropriate measures, which are key. In addition, you want to ensure a line of sight between executive action and performance. And this has been an area that's been hotly contested because I think that, companies at this point, certainly the ones in our survey, as were mentioned by my colleagues, CSR reports are basically there universally in this survey group. They're all focused on ESG issues, but there's still really a question as to whether there should be a direct link between executive pay and these ESG measures, and that's still being worked through, and how you think about linking that and making sure that you're choosing metrics that in fact the executives can move forward directionally, and therefore you're aligning incentives of how they can in fact make an impact with their pay. You do want to set goals but allow for discretion. And we're still seeing quite a bit of discretion in this area in terms of measurement of these metrics. They're not all entirely quantitative, as you see with some financial metrics. And of course, as part of that, you want to effectively track and report on ESG metrics and figure out how you're going to have appropriate controls in that area. Beyond ESG metrics, certainly human capital management oversight is a hot topic, but it really straddles the areas of company oversight, board oversight, and company risk factors, and has not yet made its direct way into the pay structures, except to the extent of where we're starting to see aspects of human capital management be part of those ESG measurements related to compensation. Other key areas we expect to be thinking about this year and certainly saw interest in, I'd start with executive perks. There, we certainly still see perks, we still see plain usage. That'll be an interesting area to look at this year with new guidance from the SEC about how to think about perks in light of COVID-19. And I think you'll see a blurring and a question of whether certain things that have traditionally been considered perks are in fact now considered necessary for business as people set up home offices and travel in different ways. So that'll be an area of certainly to keep an eye on in the coming year. And we continue to see enforcement actions from the SEC related to perk disclosure. So companies should certainly keep that in mind. I'd also note clawbacks as an area that in some respects we thought was losing steam in interest because clawbacks for the most part, certainly in this survey population, are almost universally included. And there's been such a delay on seeing an actual Dodd-Frank required clawback. A couple points here on clawbacks. One, we might see some movement in the new administration on this area, so that'll be something to be interesting to watch for. And then with new or recent headlines related to actual use of clawbacks, we have been seeing increased interest from clients and companies thinking about whether their clawback is structured in order to enable them to work through any issues that might arise in regulatory proceedings or otherwise. So we are seeing the actual use of clawbacks, so it's interesting to see what the policies themselves have to say. 96 of the top 100 companies we surveyed have clawbacks. 76 of them cover all executive officers. Interestingly, only one of them expressly covers former employees and executives. And that could be an area of interest as well to see if we see any increased coverage expressly of former employees and executive officers as clawbacks continue to develop. And really the last area to touch on, I think, for trends is looking at pay ratio and its potential interplay with say on pay voting in the coming year. With say on pay, we continue to see predominantly passes, so to speak, on say on pay, with only 5 companies in our survey having below 50% support for their say on pay, although there was a slight uptick in companies that only received between 70 and 79%. That went up to 9 companies this past year from 3 the year before. But even with that, 93 companies had a say on pay vote that was in excess of 50%. But when we look at what pay ratio might look like this year, and companies should remember this could be a year for many companies that they need to find a new median employee, as they may have just used their 3-year usage of their median employee. And with the sensitivities around how executives may have made their way through the pandemic versus the employee population more generally, we could see an increased focus on the CEO pay ratio, which is an area that has been around for a few years now. People had anticipated initially quite a lot of press and other attention to it, and quite honestly, it's been a bit of a dud in that respect. And whether we'll see any actual focus on it at a greater extent, both due to the pandemic and multiple years of data being available for proponents or others to really key into and see what's happening on that side.
So ESG disclosure trends, not just proxies, but also in the E&S, ESG, sustainability reports. I contend that one day the amount of acreage in a proxy statement about ESG might rival executive pay, but I could be wrong, but I think it's important. We'll continue to grow. Kristina, what are you seeing in both the proxy and outside?
Sure, thank you, Brock. Yes, ESG has been the hot topic for a few years now, and it really remains a primary focus of companies and investors this year, with an increasing shift towards social issues. Our proxy statements and the CSR reports were drafted in earlier this year, before a lot of the events had fully played out of 2020. However, even though they weren't fully reflective of the impact of this year's events, there are certainly some key trends that I'm sure will only be heightened in 2021 proxy statements and CSR reports. So first of all, by and large, all large companies, in fact, do either issue a CSR report as a corporate social responsibility report, or host a fully ESG dedicated website, which they regularly update and issue their reports under. And this is called, it can be called many different things. So don't be fooled if it's not called the corporate social responsibility report. They're also called sustainability or environmental reports, ESG reports, or the trending impact report. Most companies issue their CSR reports after their annual meeting. They do not include the CSR report with their proxy materials typically. And there's really still no consensus on the reporting standard that companies use. And many actually refer to multiple reporting standards. So there's no change there. However, an interesting development this year is that the Big Four accounting firms have designed their own set of standards in an attempt to sort of create some sense of standardization across companies. So that remains to be seen whether companies will pick up on that and shift to using that standard. There's also been a big shift this year in particular on the number of companies that state that they have a chief sustainability officer. So an officer really dedicated to ESG issues. In fact, I've had the pleasure of speaking to a few of them this year about some of the relevant issues. They've had a very busy year in 2020. So that's been a really interesting development. Some of the topics that are focused on in these reports, it's still sort of predictable, sustainability, employee support, diversity, climate change, human capital management all remain to be top subject matters of the reports. However, we have seen an increase this past year on issues such as human rights, citizenship, and privacy and data security, which certainly has been trending in public company disclosure, but has been a sort of a key focus recently in the CSR reports as well. As far as oversight for ESG issues, it really tends to be delegated to the Nomination and Governance Committee, with the board having overall oversight over these issues, recognizing the importance and that the board needs to stay up to date and have input. But by far, most companies delegate, the primary sort of the day-to-day responsibility to the Nom and Gov Committee. Another sort of growing trend in ESG issues and disclosure that we've seen is the inclusion of some of the top companies of their green bond offerings, information about those offerings in several different reports. It's, almost always in a press release, of course, but they've also started including information on their green bonds in their CSR reports and or their proxy statements, and sometimes in their quarterly and annual reports as well. So that's been an interesting development. Some of the top categories for the focus of these bonds are for, the use of proceeds is for green buildings, renewable energy, energy efficiency, and sustainable water and wastewater management. Most of them do, in fact, still use the green bond principle. So that's been a growing trend over the past few years. And then this year, it's been interesting because we've seen, as an aside, not necessarily in the CSR reports, but just from sustainable investing perspective, we've seen a rise in the social bonds this year, in particular, in response to COVID. We've seen the COVID bonds make an appearance, which the purpose of the bond, the use of proceeds, is to address the impact of COVID-19. So that was an interesting development this year as well. I think that the largest and the most impactful changes have been made with respect to human capital management in the ESG arena. We've really seen a shift in investor sentiment that the workplace considerations and human capital management can in fact be material to shareholders and do require sort of the heightened oversight of the board. You know, this used to be seen as really just an area of management responsibility, and there's been a big shift over the past few years, but in particular this year, in that it's not just a management responsibility, that it really does require board oversight and board input to make sure that it's part of the company's overall sort of risk assessment and strategic planning. This idea also led to the SEC adopting a new corporate governance disclosure requirement this year that requires public companies to describe, to the extent material to its business, the company's human capital resources, including the number of employees and any human capital measures or objectives that the company focuses on in managing the business. COVID has certainly heightened this idea of the importance of risk management and really long-term strategic planning that focuses on workers outside of just the executive group. That is really, in fact, a board issue, and that the focus really needs to be on planning. And I think the impact of COVID-19 on the workforce this year, whether in response to, layoffs or their health and safety, or, adjusting to remote working environments, has all had such a large impact on the workforce that I think this concept has become very real to management and board teams alike in the need for strategic planning. And some of the ways that the board can manage this planning process, really beginning to collect data, if it's not already, on retention and turnover rates, on labor practices, health and safety, engagement, diversity, inclusion, all of these really important issues to maintaining a workforce, and being able to compare that data to prior year data and see how the company's doing, and being able to evaluate the company's efforts is really important. And then you're also able to benchmark against your peers once you've had this data collected. And then you also have discussions once you have a better picture of how you've been able to manage your workforce, on how that data really relates to your goals and your strategic management of your employees going forward. And then I think cybersecurity, one last sort of important trend that we saw was, of course, an increased focus on cybersecurity, especially as it relates to being overseen by the board, specifically the audit committee, and how that interplays with your workforce as they've been working remotely from home.
So proxy disclosure trends regarding the board of directors, the 18th annual survey that your firm has done is an awesome survey. Kristina, what exactly did you find when it comes to proxy disclosures about the board?
As my colleagues may have talked about in some of our earlier videos, the board really had quite an increased role generally through the years, but specifically this year in dealing with the events of 2020. And their regular meetings, sort of quarterly meetings or monthly meetings, had turned into weekly meetings throughout the pandemic and the various social injustice movements that have occurred throughout 2020. And management has looked for more guidance than perhaps in previous years to address some of these additional risks. From a disclosure perspective, obviously there was a lot of scrutiny from the SEC this year, as well as investors, on the company's disclosure and its public filings about how the pandemic was affecting the company's business, as well as its people, and on newly crafted language and risk factors about the effects of COVID-19. Also receiving, significant scrutiny was the company's public response to concerns about employee welfare, health and safety, and to the social justice movements and issues around diversity. So most companies' proxy statements were actually drafted either before or in the early stages of the pandemic's impact on the United States. So while we did see many companies scrambling this year to convert their annual meetings into virtual meetings sort of at the last minute, the full impact of the events of 2020 were not reflected in the disclosure. We certainly expect to see 2021 to continue some of the trends I'll talk about, and really probably introduce some new ones. So a few of the trends we saw in board disclosure, specifically in proxy statements in 2020, revolved around the importance of the board's role as really an independent body with significant risk oversight. One of those trends was that the board size continues to shrink. It started at 12.5 in 2015 to an average of 11.6 in 2020. I think that really shows the trend to wanting the board to be very involved and engaged, and that's hard to do with a very large board, and hard to find people that are invested at such a significant level. There were 39 companies out of our top 100 that we surveyed that had separate chair, board chair and CEOs. Obviously an increasing number showing the trend of wanting the board really to provide that independent oversight role. And 73 out of the 100 companies had a lead independent director. Another important trend that we saw was in board refreshment. There's a continuing focus on this key issue facing the nominating and governance committees and the boards overall, since they're increasingly under pressure to change the face of the boardroom. Three of the principal board refreshment mechanics are mandatory retirement age. This is used very frequently. 71 companies actually disclosed that they had a mandatory retirement age for non-executive directors. Typically around the age of 72 was the most common. Another way to increase board refreshment is to have term limits. This is really not used very frequently because companies often state that the reason they don't want to have term limits is that they really appreciate and value the insight and knowledge that directors that have served for an extended period of time have to the company. And the third, which is really an increasing tool that really has skyrocketed over the past year or two, is the board self-evaluation process and how it's been expanded. So a few trends in the board evaluation process have been that there's been an increasing number of companies that actually have individual director evaluations as opposed to just board and committee evaluations. This is really a fairly new trend that a significant number of the top companies have been doing. And these evaluations have been done through a combination of self-evaluation, peer evaluation, or both. There's also been an increasing use of third-party facilitators, such as governance advisory firms or external counsel, to aid in conducting these evaluations. And then boards have also increasingly been addressing evaluation matters and proactively seeking feedback on an ongoing basis, as opposed to just once a year. They're perhaps addressing evaluation matters on a quarterly basis. So it's definitely become an increasing issue in the forefront of board meetings. Companies also have shown at an increasing level a disclosure in their proxy statements about the company's response to evaluations. This is also a fairly new trend, and where they're talking about the results of the evaluations, but as well as the proactive measures they're taking in response to those evaluations, which can include reassigning committee structures, redesigning them, reevaluating responsibilities of the different committees, increasing director education programs and the like. We've also seen an increase in the director's skill matrix, as well as various diversity statistics being included in the matrix. The SEC requires companies to disclose the experience, qualifications, attributes, and skills that led to the conclusion that the individual should serve as a director on the board of the company. Now, historically, that disclosure has been at the end of a director's biography. Increasingly, companies, especially the largest companies, have been including a director's matrix that compares all of the directors against each other and shows the various skills that each director has in the form of a matrix. Now, of the top 100 companies, about 75% included this matrix as opposed to just the disclosure in the biographies. In those matrix, there has also been an increasing focus on ESG and human capital management experience. Over half of the companies included either diversity, sustainability, and/or human capital management skills in the matrix. And on diversity itself, they've also been increasingly disclosing in either the proxy statements or in frequently as well in their corporate social responsibility reports, their diversity statistics. And we were sort of excited to see this year really some advancements have been made, and some of the highlights have been that 53 of the top 100 companies had 30% or more women on their board of directors. 51 of the companies have added one or more female directors since September 30th, 2018. And 8 of the board chairs were women this past year, 4 of which were also the CEOs. So there's definitely been some exciting events and trends in the disclosure and the proxy statements this year with respect to the board of directors.
And Kristina, with respect to diversity, it's really interesting to see that and that increase, and in particular also an increased presence of disclosure about race and ethnicity in board diversity, moving toward an expanded perspective on diversity from the gender diversity that has been the focus in the last couple of years. And something for companies to keep in mind, ISS has new policies out this year on how they're going to take a look at board diversity, and in particular, that if a board does not yet have a female member of the board, that company could be at risk of a withhold recommendation from ISS on the nominating and governance committee director, chairperson. And in addition, ISS has an expanded perspective on policies that are presented by shareholders about disclosure on diversity, and have expanded its perspective to touch on not just gender, but also race and ethnicity-based policies.
So 2021, what are the key things that people should be aware of, the key takeaways? Richard?
Okay, so just going back to the role of the corporation, I've seen some of the reporting and in the press that potentially with the change in administration, that boards and C-suites may get a break from what they've been going through and jumping into the fray on social and political issues. So I think it will be really interesting to see if that holds up. Given the fact that the Business Roundtable statement is in some ways a promise in the opposite direction, not to go back to the days of passive detachment, but to focus on the relation of the corporation to its stakeholders. And I think it also sets the stage for shareholders and other stakeholders to demand accountability and level criticism for not meeting the goals of the statement, which of course are pretty subjective. So, it'll be interesting to see whether that dynamic plays out, and, there's an increasing demand for visibility on ESG issues.
Yeah, so building off of, Richard's sentiments, I think this year has been probably one of the top years for board involvement, whether they like it or not. We've seen the role of the board increase multifold this year, moving even to having weekly meetings whether in response to, to COVID throughout much of the year, and how the company was going to respond from a business continuity perspective, addressing layoffs, addressing human capital issues, addressing social issues with response to, the social injustices movement. I think that is probably here to stay, whether they like it or not. It's also, needs to be a focus of the company then to choose board members that will be actively involved and who do want to have a stake in the direction of the company. And that certainly is going to be a shift in the corporate structure, as well as some of the new developments with respect to human capital management, and the board's increasing oversight role with respect to those issues and the planning process going forward.
Yeah, and I would say, Brock, stemming from those same types of sentiments of the expanded role here, what we're seeing on the executive compensation and corporate human capital, corporate governance side is that there is an expanded interest beyond the executive group. So that executive compensation disclosure remains of key importance, but issues like succession planning, so looking at that next tier of executives and seeing who's going to be available to take on these roles, either on an emergency or a longer term basis, and the human capital management aspects that touch on all of the employee population, and seeing those points integrated actually into executive compensation plans and programs where there's an evaluation of how the current executive team is actually doing with respect to succession planning, diversity, health and safety of employees is a key trend to continue to watch. This blending of the importance of executive compensation, but also the broader employee population as an important aspect of company risk management and company long-term strategy.
So thank you very much. 18 years, that's quite an amazing run. I'm sure that it started shortly after Linda Quinn joined the firm, but just when law firm memos were being born, really. And so to have the staying power that your survey has had, and it was always an important thing for me to blog about, and for year after year. So your survey is as old as long as I've been blogging. So I know how long and what a commitment that is to get all the team together to do the work. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.